In this subunit, we will continue our discussion of consideration by exploring the concept of legal value. All right, before we begin our discussion of legal value, let's just refresh our memories. Remember, a promise is not enforceable unless a promisee pays for it. A promisee has to give up something of legal value in exchange for the promise, right? So you could pay cash for the promise, but usually you give up something of legal value instead. All right, let's talk about the topics that we're going to discuss in this subunit. First, we're going to introduce the concept of legal detriment. More on that later. We're going to look at legal value and legal detriment in the bilateral contract situation. We're going to look at legal detriment and legal value in the unilateral contract situation. We're going to talk about adequacy of consideration and whether courts will look at the evenness of the exchange. And the answer is no, they won't. We're going to talk about the ancient doctrine, not the ancient doctrine, the ancient convention of the seal, which no longer exists, but that's all I'm going to say about it, that it no longer exists. All right, let's talk about legal detriment. Now, legal value means legal detriment, right? Promisee suffers some sort of legal detriment, not an actual detriment, but a legal detriment. So this is what legal detriment means. You do something you had no legal obligation to do, or you refrain from doing something that you had a legal right to do. Once again, legal detriment is where you do something you had no legal obligation to do, or you refrain from doing something you had a legal right to do. Now, of course, if we're talking about bilateral contracts and we're talking for promise, then it's not doing something you had no legal obligation to do. It is promising to do something you had no legal obligation to do. And same thing for refraining from doing something you had a legal right to do. You promised to refrain from doing something you had a legal right to do. All right, let's talk about legal detriment in the bilateral contract situation. So, as I just mentioned, legal detriment in the bilateral contract situation is promising to do something you had no legal obligation to do, or promising to refrain from doing something that you had a legal right to do. Remember, in the bilateral contract, each party is a promisor and a promisee. So, focus on the promise. When there is an issue about whether a promise is enforceable, focus on that promise and then look and see which party is the promisee of that promise. And then you ask, did the promisee promise to do something that she had no legal obligation to do? Or you ask, did the promisee promise to refrain from doing something she had a legal right to do? Let's look at a couple of examples. Bob promises, I will pay you $5,000 to paint my house. Mary promises, I will paint your house. So when we're doing a consideration analysis, remember we focus on the promisee. What did the promisee give in return for the promise? Did promisee suffer a legal detriment? So if we're asking, is Bob's promise supported by consideration, we need to look at what Mary gave in return. Did Mary suffer a legal detriment? If we're asking, is Mary's promise supported by consideration, right? Mary promises, I will paint your house. We have to ask what Bob gave in return. Did Bob give anything in legal value? Did Bob give anything of legal value in return? Did Bob suffer a legal detriment? All right, so first let's look, is Bob's promise supported by consideration? Well, we're looking at Mary's legal detriment, and Mary's legal detriment is she promised to do something she had no legal obligation to do. She promised to paint Bob's house. Is Mary's promise supported by consideration? Well, we need to look at Bob. What's Bob's legal detriment? Bob promised to do something he had no legal obligation to do. He promised to pay Mary $5,000. All right, let's look at a second example. Bob promises, I will pay you $1,000 if you don't cut your tree down in your backyard. Apparently Bob likes Mary's tree in her backyard. It gives him shade. And so he says to Mary, I will pay you $1,000 if you don't cut down your tree. Mary then promises in return not to cut down her tree. Is Bob's promise supported by consideration? We have to look at Mary's legal detriment. What did Mary give in return? Mary promised to refrain from doing something she had a legal right to do. We'll assume that in where Mary lives that she is allowed to cut down her tree. So when Mary says, I will not cut down the tree, she promised to refrain from doing something she had a legal right to do. Is Mary's promise supported by consideration? Well, Mary promises, I will not cut down the tree. We have to look at Bob's legal detriment. Did Bob promise to do something that he did not have a legal obligation to do? Yes, he promised to pay Mary $1,000. He had no legal obligation to pay Mary $1,000. All right, let's continue our discussion of legal value by exploring legal value and legal detriment in the unilateral contract situation. Remember, the unilateral contract is a promise seeking return performance, not a promise seeking return promise. Right? Here, in the unilateral contract situation, the actual performance by the promisee, by the offeree, that is the legal detriment. So once again, we don't ask whether the promisee promised to do something. We ask whether the promisee did something. So did the promisee suffer a legal detriment? Did the promisee do something she had no legal obligation to do? Or we could say, did the promisee promise to refrain from doing something that she had a legal right to do? That is the legal detriment analysis in the unilateral contract situation. All right, here are a couple of examples. So homeowner says to real estate broker, if you find a buyer for my house, I will pay you a 5% commission. This is an offer seeking performance. I want you to perform. If I'm the homeowner, I want the broker to perform. I don't want the broker to promise to sell my house, right? The broker wouldn't make this promise. So broker finds a buyer. All right, we have a contract. Is homeowner's promise supported by consideration? Well, we have to focus on the broker's legal detriment. The broker is the promisee of homeowner's promise, so we focus on the broker's legal detriment. Did the broker do something that he had no legal obligation to do? Yes, he found a buyer for the house. He had no legal obligation to do so, therefore he suffered a legal detriment. The homeowner's promise is supported by consideration and is therefore enforceable. Let's look at another situation. An uncle says to the niece, if you refrain from going to parties until you finish law school, I will pay you $50,000 when you graduate. Once again, clearly this is the unilateral contract situation. Clearly we have the uncle who is making a promise that is seeking performance and not seeking promise. He didn't want the niece to say, I promise not to. He wanted the niece to perform. So the facts say that the niece indeed did not go to any parties during law school. Is the uncle's promise supported by consideration? Well, did the niece suffer a legal detriment? Well, remember the question. She either did something that she had no legal obligation to do, or she refrained from doing something that she had a legal right to do. Do you spot which one this is? Yes, this is the second one. Here, Mary had a legal right to go to parties. We all have a legal right to go to parties. I think the Beastie Boys made that clear to us, did they not? All right, so now I lost my train of thought. All right, so Mary had a legal right, the niece had a legal right to go to parties. She did not go to parties in response to uncle's promise. Therefore, she suffered a legal detriment. Uncle's promise is enforceable because it is supported by consideration. All right, let's talk about adequacy, right? Will a court look at the adequacy of consideration? Will the court say, well, you gave up a legal detriment, but it really wasn't enough? And the answer is no. Courts do not ask whether the consideration was adequate. Sometimes you hear courts talk about peppercorns. All you have to do is give a peppercorn in return. I don't like when courts say that, but you get the idea that the court is not in the business of judging the equality of the exchange. Effectively saying, listen, promisor, if you were seeking that in exchange for your promise and the other party suffered a legal detriment, no matter how small, I'm not going to go in and second guess your judgment. We're going to rely on the promisor's judgment about what she wants in exchange for her promise. So let's look at an example. I'll pay you $1 million if you won't sit on your porch for the entire summer. Would you accept this? Yes, you would. Does this look like an unequal exchange? Does this look? Yes, it does. But the court will not ask whether this was an unequal exchange. Did you promise to do something or did you do something? This one looks like a unilateral contract situation where the promisor was seeking performance. So did you refrain from doing something you had a legal right to do? Yes, I had a legal right to sit on my porch, and therefore I suffered a legal detriment. The promisor must pay me $1 million. Okay, we'll talk about this again when we talk about exchange. We're also going to talk about exchange. The issue will come up again. I just want to give you a fair warning about that now. Okay. Sometimes courts will talk about sufficient consideration. Don't think sufficient consideration means adequate consideration. It does not. When a court says there was sufficient consideration or party X's promise was supported by sufficient consideration, the court is just saying the promise was supported by consideration. They just use sufficient consideration. It's not a measure of adequacy. It's just saying the promise was supported by consideration. I'll say it sometimes too. I'll say the promise was supported by sufficient consideration. I'm not asking about the adequacy or the equivalency of the exchange. All right, let's continue our discussion of the adequacy of consideration by looking at a little example. This is a fun example. So the uncle says to niece, I will pay you $50,000 if you refrain from smoking, drinking alcohol, doing illegal drugs, and dancing until you are 21. Niece refrains from all those activities until she is 21. Here's the question. Is the uncle's promise supported by consideration? Well, let's go back to our rule. We're looking at the uncle's promise. We have to see what the promisee gave in exchange. Did the promisee give something in exchange? Did the niece give something of legal value in exchange for uncle's promise? Did she suffer a legal detriment? All right. Well, did she do anything? No, it looks like this is all about refraining from doing something. So remember, the rule is if you refrain from doing something which you had a legal right to do, then you suffered a legal detriment. So I'm looking, and it says until you turn 21. So I'm assuming the niece is not 21 yet. So before she turns 21, is she allowed to smoke? I don't think so. I think it's illegal for her to smoke. So arguably, she did not refrain from doing something she had a legal right to do. All right. She refrained from drinking alcohol. I think in most states you can't drink until you're 21. So she did not refrain from doing something she had a legal right to do. She refrained from doing illegal drugs. Needless to say, illegal drugs are illegal, and doing them is illegal. So she did not refrain from doing something she had a legal right to do. And dancing. Did she refrain from doing something she had a legal right to do? Yes, she refrained from dancing. Now, you might look at this and you say, well, only 1 out of the 4, but that's enough. That is enough. We don't look at the adequacy of the consideration. So, uncle's promise is supported by sufficient consideration, right? Not adequate consideration. We're not saying that. It is supported by consideration. Why? Niece refrained from doing something she had a legal right to do. What is it? Dancing. And that's it. Oh, dancing. All right, let's talk about a fun and an easy topic, the seal. You've all seen the seals in movies or something. There's some melted wax and then there's a seal, and that's put on a document, and it's very official and very formal. Well, in days of yore, it used to be that the seal was a substitute for consideration. You didn't have to suffer legal detriment. All you had to do was have a seal, and the contract was a binding contract. This is not the case anymore, right? In most jurisdictions, or I think in all jurisdictions in the U.S., that the seal has been abolished as a substitute for consideration, either by statute or by common law. So the seal is no longer a substitute for consideration. Pretty easy topic, pretty easy to remember. Let's look at an interesting policy issue by exploring a familiar fact pattern. Uncle says to niece, I will pay you $50,000 if you refrain from doing illegal drugs until you're 21. And the niece refrains from doing illegal drugs until she's 21. Is the uncle's promise enforceable? Well, we ask, is the uncle's promise supported by consideration? Did the niece give something of legal value in exchange for his promise? Did the niece suffer a legal detriment? Well, what's a legal detriment? Well, one thing is refraining from doing something you had a legal right to do. Did she have a legal right to do illegal drugs? And the answer is no. So, our strict application of the consideration doctrine in this case says the uncle's promise is not enforceable because it is not supported by consideration. But you can see how this creates a disincentive. By saying that uncle's promise is not enforceable, we undermine his ability to bind himself to contract. And we undermine everybody in a similar situation from being able to bind themselves in contract. Imagine that someone in this jurisdiction now says, well, I would like to encourage that person from engaging in illegal activities. I will promise them something if they stop those illegal activities. Well, why would the promisee say, okay, I will stop, if they know that the promiser's promise will not be legally enforceable? So, in this case, our uncle might regret making the promise and might go to court and say, my promise is unenforceable because it's not supported by consideration. But if the court says, okay, your promise is not supported by consideration, it's not enforceable, now this applies as legal precedent in the jurisdiction. And in the future, promisers who want to encourage someone to refrain from engaging in illegal activities will be less able to do so. Why? Because the other parties, the promisees, will know that the promise is unenforceable.